Before we get started with the panel, we've heard from our development partner colleagues, and we thought what we should do before we really get into the meat of things is also hear from the private sector what's working from a perspective of investing in Africa, but also what's not, and what do we need to have fixed while we're here over the next few days. And prior to that, we thought we'll just put a bit of context and share a bit of what's happening around the world and the implications for investments and for Africa. So as McKinsey, we actually did a study which we published earlier this year around UN Week, where we studied 71 emerging markets around the world. And our question, it was a very simple question. It was, what has driven growth? Those have really outperformed growth. How did they do it? What was the secret sauce? And of course, there are many of these emerging markets in Africa that were included. What we found is that of these 71, 18 delivered most of the growth. So there were 18, and we call them outperformers, who've delivered most of the growth. And when we talk about growth, we talk about 50 years, right? Not 5, 10 years, but 50 years. 18 outperformers. Out of those, there were 7 who were long-term outperformers. So over 50 years, they've grown GDP per capita on average 3.5%, right? Consistently over 50 years. By the way, they're all in sort of, East and Southeast Asia, right? There were another 11 that what we call recent outperformers. So they've done the same, but they've done that over 20 years. Not 50, but over 20 years. There's only one African country in that group, which is Ethiopia, right? Who's actually grown consistently over 20 years. When we start to look at more recent accelerators, if you take a 10-year window, then you start to see countries like Ghana, countries like Rwanda, countries like Mozambique in that group. But overall, out of the 18 outperformers, there was only one in Africa. Now, how did they do this, right? And this is, actually what the growth that they generated over that period. So the high-income countries, the advanced economies, grew on average 2% over a 50-year period. Out of those 7 outperformers, you'll see China. China, by far, exceeded that, right? They grew at 7% every year over the last 50 years. The other 6 long-term outperformers grew about 5%. Again, that's over a 50-year period, right? So that's quite significant. The recent ones like India, Ethiopia, they grew about 6%. But again, this was over a 20-year period, right? Over a 20-year period. And then the others, sort of other emerging markets, even underperformed the high economy. What's important here is not just the growth. The growth is a number, but the implication of this growth. Through this growth, these countries lifted over a billion people out of extreme poverty over this period of time. Over a billion people lifted out of extreme poverty, but that was primarily in China, India, and Indonesia. In addition to that, they've had huge increases in human development indicators. So you look at mortality rate, you look at life expectancy has increased by over 10 points in many of these economies. So there's fundamental implications to people's lives by driving this growth, right? The fundamental implications. Now, how did they do it? And we studied a lot of it, and it really comes down to 3 things, right? One is productivity, that then drives income, and that drives demand, right? So from a productivity perspective, what they did, they promoted competition, and we'll come back to it about the private sector. You'll see that private sector companies in these emerging economies are actually much more competitive than in advanced economies. So they really promoted competition amongst these companies. They invested big time, and I'll come back to that because investment is really at the core of how they delivered it. They invested especially in infrastructure. And then they leveraged technology really to drive total factor productivity. And what's very interesting, we spend a lot of time, I think, on the continent talking about, which sectors should we focus on, which sectors should we drive. What we found was that in-sector productivity was 3 times more important than sector mix. So it's much more important, whatever sector you choose, it's much more important to be productive within that sector, right? So in-sector productivity is much more important than the mix of sectors in our economies. So something we should think about. That increase in productivity then drove companies to actually increase incomes for the corporations, but also for households, right? So that led to gains in incomes, and then that again led to increased demand for products and services, right? So a very virtuous cycle from productivity to income and to demand, and that is what has driven the growth with a pro-growth agenda in these economies. Now, investments. Why are investments critical for this? If you look at what again these companies did, on one hand, they really worked with firms to drive productivity. On the other hand, they made sure that the governments were delivering. But at the investment level, which was at the core of it, they did two things. At the macro level, capital accumulation increased significantly in these countries. And they invested more, right? You know, the ones that outperformed, on average, invested 30% of the GDP on a year on year to drive this. And they focus on a combination of foreign investors, right, and the multinationals, but also on domestic investments, right? So they really had a good mix of both. And that's at the macro level. At the micro level, if you look at the firms themselves, firms in these economies, again, invested twice as much as firms in developed markets, twice as much in these economies. And they made it, you know, they didn't do small investments here and there. They actually were quite bold, and they made decisions very fast. We heard today from the panel around the importance of speed of decision making, right? So again, at the macro level, huge investments, but it's even at the micro level. So investments are actually fundamental to this growth that then translates to everything we've seen around lifting people out of extreme poverty, improving life expectancies in our countries. Now, where do we stand as a continent today? We started doing some work as we were preparing for this with the bank, and we looked at the 5 growth sectors, right? Infrastructure, agriculture, industry and manufacturing, energy, and the social sector, healthcare and education. And if you look at, you know, the projects in execution, there's about $1 trillion of projects under execution somewhere in the execution stage, right? They're not all being developed now, but about $1 trillion of projects across the funnel there. And we predict that that's going to grow to $3 trillion. So again, you know, huge growth. And as we know, we need capital to drive this growth, but we also need to develop on these projects. But again, huge opportunities for growth in investments. But what are the issues, right? We then started to get a lot more granular and, you know, we put together from different sources, a database of about 8,000 projects represent $4 trillion. Again, there could be some ideas, but that's at the front end of the funnel, all the way to about 600 projects that are really ready for financing, right? And across that sort of project funnel, there's a clear role that we hope AIF can play. One is on improving the policy environment at the front end of the funnel, because that's critical. And then as the projects evolve, you know, the bankability, we spoke about it this morning with the panelists about how do you improve the bankability and get projects quicker to a bankable stage. Then as they are there now and you start to develop them, how do you enhance the project preparation and actually development of the projects? And then finally, how do you then match stakeholders with interesting projects, right? So those are the 4 things we would like to make sure we focus on here. As we interviewed quite a few of you, we know there are a number of barriers to making this happen, right? So one barrier a lot of people talked about is the risk in Africa. People always think about, you know, Africa. There's always a perception versus the reality. But, you know, it is out there, you know, is it risky? And how can we change the environment to make it less risky for investors to come to the continent? Secondly is, you know, the dearth of bankable projects. How do you bring projects much quicker to bankability? That has been a clear challenge. Third is the regulatory environment, right? We know the World Bank just put out the ease of doing business. We're very excited about Mauritius and Rwanda and Togo and Cote d'Ivoire and a number of these who are actually, you know, top 10 reformers in the world. But, you know, we still need to continue that journey of improving our regulatory environment. And then finally, the information asymmetry. Some people are saying, look, you know, we have money, we want to invest, but, you know, we don't know where to put the money, right? So how do you close that gap? And just to conclude in my last slide, and hopefully Ahmed El-Sewedi will join us, but if not, we'll start with Ronnie and Rakesh, to say, you know, so what is the role of the AIF? Why are we here? You know, we all go to many, many conferences. What are we going to do differently here to address this? One is, again, creating this platform that then brings, you know, investors together with projects, so we make sure that we can actually match make certain deals. 2 is, you know, mobilizing investments, right? We need much more. The president talked today about, you know, the 1% of the assets under management around the world. If we can bring that into the continent, how do we mobilize larger pools of investments, which are important for us, as we know. 3 is the regulatory environment, as we discussed. What do we need to do to change the regulatory environment and make it much more conducive to investments on our continent? And 4, which for me I think is actually much more important, is just changes the ways of working, right? We go to many of these conferences and we talk, and, you know, I think I always say talking and connecting and networking is important, but how do we do things differently and make sure that we actually come out of here with very concrete projects or concrete recommendations that we can implement to help increase not just investments in the continent, but as we know, at the end of the day, it's about improving the lives of our fellow citizens across Africa. So let me stop there and then join my panelists. So welcome, Ronnie and Rakesh, and I said hopefully Ahmed will join us soon as well. Ronnie, let's start with you. You were CEO of Tello, and you invested across the continent. Why don't you tell us just a bit about the sectors and the countries you invested in? But more importantly, I think for the audience, it's be good to understand what has your experience been investing on the continent?
Archer, thank you very much. In the first instance, I'd like to express my absolute gratitude to the African Development Bank under the leadership of President Adesina. The vision to create the Africa Investment Forum is really, I think we can't say enough about what it means. I think President Orama said it correctly. This is it's an opportunity to rebrand the continent of Africa. So President Adesina, thank you for the vision. I would like to also thank the government of South Africa and the government of the province of Gauteng for supporting this vision and allowing us to all be here together in this province of ours. I advocate that that Premier Makura is a hard worker, in spite of earlier comments. So, Tello Group is really we see ourselves as an African group. We look at the continent rather than a country. We stand on three legs: infrastructure, industry, finance. Those are really our three legs. In industry, today we are probably the biggest exporter of resin out of the continent of Africa. We export to Europe and to Asia. In infrastructure, we've been financing capital equipment for the railway sector and have bigger ambition to, rail. We recognize rail in Africa as a huge challenge in terms of mobility, transportation. And we think it's a great opportunity to create capacity, both freight and passenger, well considered. So we are in rail, and as mentioned, we finance capital equipment across the continent for the railway sector. And we work with development finance institutions like the Industrial Development Corporation and other institutions as well. What do we find as the challenge? It's very interesting. So you
can start by what's working, and then you can get to challenges.
So what's working, I think a great point of excitement is I don't think we've been at an era where African governments are so serious about attracting investment into their countries. So from that headline, I think it's very exciting. I think the second point of excitement, the African multilaterals, most of which are on stage today, I think are onto a new paradigm. They understand, I think like the alignment between themselves and our group, as an example, is the comprehension that nobody understands Africa better than we as Africans. Therefore, we accept that the interpretation of African risk is mispriced, both financially and operationally. So that for us as entrepreneurs represents an enormous opportunity because like the multilaterals, we can position ourselves to arbitrage African risk. We can mobilize best of global capacity, best of global capital to arbitrage African risk. That's a great opportunity for anybody who wants to be entrepreneurial on the continent of Africa. We understand Africa better than anybody else. Africans understand Africa better than anybody else. And we can arbitrage that risk and create industrial capacity, infrastructure capacity, and mobilize global capital. So that's a big headline. What are the challenges? I won't dwell on it, but it is a fact. Our DFIs are slow. They get there eventually, but they move really slowly. In terms of our ambition, we are implementing today what we've been talking to DFIs many years ago. That's the reality. And the plea is we have to get the DFIs to be a lot more responsive. I think development of infrastructure and industry on the continent of Africa has to be implemented with a lot more urgency.
And,
That's the first.
okay. And just on that, I'm trying to, just let's be practical. Do they need to, cut the timelines by 50%, by 80%? What's your sense?
Look, I think we have to understand that I think as one of the panelists spoke earlier, their role is to mobilize global capital. So risk has to be managed. But I think we accept that we have to manage risk, but the systems to which you process transactions, I think have to be, one way or another, have to be reconsidered and moved along. That's the first. The second challenge that we encounter very often in pursuing investments on the continent, the regulatory environment, approval processes. I'll give you a very hard example that we experience quite regularly. So, and I won't mention the country, but a country, we buy capital equipment, very, very expensive capital equipment, and it sits on our balance sheet. We deploy it to the user in country. In this particular country, the legislation still doesn't accommodate a situation where the owner of the capital equipment and the user are two separate entities. The world has moved on. The user is not always the owner. That's a real practical. So consequentially, the whole process of now you've spent tens of millions of dollars buying a suite of capital equipment, you're deploying it into a country. The customs importation process just doesn't accommodate that. So what we have to do is spend enormous amounts of time with sort of the Treasury, customs authorities pleading, and this is equipment that will support development in country. It's not just importing consumer goods. This is to create infrastructure capacity in country. So the 2 points, without speaking extensively, the 2 points that I would really plead is we have to accelerate our activity toward development on the continent, and the DFIs are the multilaterals are an important part of that. The second is that African governments also have to realize that we have to reform the regulatory environment. We're not asking for special favors. What we want is certainty, predictability. That's really it.
Right. Perfect. So speed of process in the DFIs and reforming the regulatory, 2 topics we will be discussing at length over the next few days. Rakesh, let's come to you. You actually invest not just in Africa, but in the Middle East and in India and a few other countries. We'd love to first hear a bit about what you do in general, but more importantly, how you compare Africa to some of these other regions from an investment attraction perspective.
Thank you, Ajo. Before I respond to your question, I think just want to tell you that I'm on my way back here from the Global CEO Conference in Thailand, which is hosted by Forbes every year. And when they start out the conference, they have this tradition of always saying how much money is in the room. And the reason why it's done is so that they know you're not there to waste your time. And last time we were a week ago in Thailand, they said there's $300 billion in the room. And I think it was a great setting in the first session with Dr. Adesina and the Premier and other panelists, where we could see the value of what is sitting here in terms of the financial institutions and the support that is there for Africa. And to that end, I'd like to thank Dr. Adesina. I had met him in July last year when he talked about the AIF, and 18 months later, we're here. And also to Premier of Gauteng for actually giving us this platform. And I use the word platform because it's what we're here to do. Getting back to the industries that we're involved in, CMA Investment Holdings is a family investment holding. I've been based in Dubai for the last 30 years. We have a focus on IT. We are the Microsoft partner in 8 South and Southeast Asian countries. We have a software development center in Sri Lanka. We have a document management business there. And we also have a BPO in the Philippines, where I'm coming back from. We are also in the education space. We currently own 3 universities, 2 of which are in Dubai. The first 2 are Curtin University and Murdoch University from Western Australia. We set up our first African university in Ghana in 2013 in collaboration with Lancaster University from the UK. And for those of you who know, Lancaster is the 6th ranked British university in the world, in the UK. And to bring a highly ranked British university into African shores speaks a lot about what we're trying to do for the future of education. We're also trying to set up 8 more campuses in Africa. They're going to be in southern, eastern, and northern Africa. So this is a plan that we're rolling out, and we're putting some project proposals out that we will be looking at. Additionally, we also are looking at educational infrastructure, not just in terms of hostels, but also in terms of laboratories and looking at the future of education. And the third area that we're invested into is media. And a lot of you would be familiar with CNBC Africa and Forbes Africa. These are the businesses that we launched in 2007. We are working with the African continent in changing perceptions, and I'll talk to that a little more in a bit. So as a family, we're invested in 20 countries around the world, all of which are emerging markets, and we employ a little over 1,500 people. Talking a little bit about the experiences in different countries, I think when you look at different parts of the world, the key issue when you go in as an investor is how you're welcomed. And the same goes for how you're welcomed at home when you go to somebody's house. And if the landing, as Dr. Adesina said, is soft, it's facilitated, you're given the help, you'll go back there. If the visa processes work, and this is going back to basics for investors. I think these are critical areas. But the areas where I find that, and I'm not going to go into talking about what is good somewhere and what is not, because comparatives are based on circumstances in different parts of the world. So where you have certain advantages, you may not have those in other parts. But areas where I think that we have got to pay a bit of attention here in Africa, and the first of which is basically in changing perceptions. And I think changing perceptions is not the purview or responsibility of a single institution, a single government. It's, I think, a collective responsibility, because nobody's going to invest into an environment if they hear all the time that things are wrong. And this is what we have been trying to do, is try and bring positive stories about the continent. The second area that we typically find problematic stems from things like continuity and consistency. Speed has already been talked about, and I won't dwell on it. But when change takes place, I don't think we manage change appropriately. A lot of policies get changed when governments changed, and I don't think we have a very strong civil service that manages this process of change. And I think this needs to be strengthened a lot in the context of the African continent. The next area is the cost of capital. We've talked about capital being available, but when you look at businesses like us, which are smaller businesses, and I look at the context of countries like Ghana or Nigeria, or even looking at East Africa, banks are charging 24 to 26% to provide you capital. Now, this kind of capital cannot afford returns, and it impedes progress. I think there needs to be some revolutionization of our basic financial institutions, not just the DFIs. I think the banking system needs to be looked at to provide better capital, because if you don't provide the capital, there's no way we can look at long-term businesses. And 24% interest, you've got to be in the drugs business to get some kind of a return. The other issue that we are looking at is indigenization, which I think is a very important aspect. We talk about Africanization of whatever we do, and I think man, labor, and capital must all be from within. We've brought that value into the system. When we set up CNBC, we made sure that 100% of our staff here is African. And that's another approach that you got to have, is make sure that you actually upskill people in the environment that you're in, which is why we are in the business of education. So I think there's a lot to be done on the continent. There are a lot of impediments, but we are here because we believe in the continent. We believe that there's a long-term future here. If you look at all the frontiers today, and we are invested in all emerging markets, I find that being here in Africa is one of the greatest decisions that I made 14 years ago.
Thank you. So we're going to come to some questions and comments from the audience. Could we get the mics ready? And I just realized we had 7 development partner institutions representing the first panel. We only have 2 private sector people here. I'm sure there are a lot of private sector people in the audience. So I'd love also to, we would love to hear from you as to what is the one thing you want to make sure we come out of this conference with, or this forum with, right? So get ready for that, if we can get the mics. But let me come back to you, Ronnie. I mean, you know, the challenges, so Rakesh has added to your list, you know, policy consistency, changing perceptions, cost of capital. We've been talking about these issues for a while.
Yeah.
Why are we not making progress?
Yeah.
Or maybe what would it take for us to make progress faster on these issues?
Yeah. So I think Rakesh is absolutely correct. But I think what we also haven't recognized, and this is, and I'll mention it by name, this is the great proposition that I think Alhaji Aliko Dangote has planted in our minds. What we have to have, like President Adesina talked about the vision of President Babak Ndiaye in institutionalizing capital mobilization on the continent of Africa, we also have to recognize that we have to institutionalize, if you look at any brand, whether it's a Coca-Cola or think of any brand, that's institutionalization of a product, right? What we have to recognize as Africans also is that we have to institutionalize the ability to deliver, whether on infrastructure or on industrial capacity, is the first point. So there still aren't as many African brands, homegrown brands, that are threaded. We're starting to see more and more, but that are recognized for the capacity to deliver on a certain industrial process, as an example, or a certain infrastructure process. More and more, we have to have the capacity to, and the credibility to develop projects and implement projects as a brand. It's very difficult then for capital, I think. If we're incidental and we're first-time developers, there's a value chain that you have to go through before you get institutional credibility. And I think that's what Dangote as a group has led on the African continent, and that's why they have such credibility. And when they go to market to raise capital, they're basically, the banks are price takers rather than price givers. It's that institutional credibility to develop and execute a project credibly time and time and time again. I think we have to take responsibility as well as African entrepreneurs. Our destiny cannot be limited to being, political regime-based entrepreneurs or extractive industries based entrepreneurs. What we have to do is institutionalize development and execution of projects.
Yeah. And the good news is Elijah will be here tomorrow, so we can hear from him as well.
Yeah.
So Rakesh, you're in 20 countries. What have these other countries done well, or how have they done it? What can we learn from them in terms of some of the issues you talked about?
I think, you know, one of the points that we look at is regulation. And how a country transforms its regulatory environment is critical. And this is across all sectors. For the last 3 to 4 years, at every gathering, we talk about the impact of technology and, you know, what AI is doing. And we've got so many acronyms today that it's difficult to even follow them. The issue is that our regulatory system does not bring about the change that is necessary. So if you look at just the education business, for instance, there are countries where you still require 100 acres of land. We are not a real estate company. I don't want to go and set up a real estate project. Education in the future is about collaborative learning. It's about distributed learning. It's about technology. It's about providing bandwidth. Look at your consumer. Look at how your consumer is changing. And I think we don't spend time in the regulatory system to bring about this change. And if the change does not happen in the countries where you're looking for investments in those areas, you'll always stay behind. And some of the countries, like when you look at India, you look at Malaysia, you look at some of these other countries that have embraced technology, you find that it becomes easier because they are adapting to the needs of the future.
All right, so they've leveraged technology to help address some of these issues.
Yep.
Okay, let's come to the audience. I don't know if you have mics around, but please, you know, raise your hand if you have a question or comment. again, questions to our panelists, but also would love to hear, especially from the private sector people here, what would you like to see done differently that we can try to address over the course of our 2 days here? There's a hand at the front. Is there a mic? And please introduce yourself and try to keep your questions or comments short. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, l'Assemblée. Je suis Claudine Afiavi Prudencio du Bénin. Depuis le matin que je suis ici, je n'ai pas entendu parler du Bénin. Je suis un ancien ministre du Bénin, député à l'Assemblée nationale et membre d'un groupe qui investit au Bénin. Il s'appelle le groupe Pétroline. Je suis là avec le président du groupe Pétroline.
I am here with the CEO of that group investing in Benin. I am also here with the ambassador of Benin to South Africa, with other members of the group here. Petroline invests in infrastructure in Benin. Now, Mr. Mtuli talked about investment in the rail sector. That is something that is of great interest to us because we need rail transport today. We need ports, deep water ports. We need dry ports. We need several dry ports. Please, your question. My question is, I would like the structure investing in railways come to Benin because I haven't heard any mention of Benin since I've been here this morning. The CEO of Petroline will also take the floor because he has invested quite a bit in Benin. Yes, we'll come back to the CEO.
It's an invitation for you to come and do railways in Benin.
When, madam?
Okay. Donc, il viendra. Other questions, comments? There's one at the back.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. My name is Mikko Kuuskoski, and I represent FinFund, which is the development finance institution of Finland. I'm not the private sector representative, but I'd just like to add my comment to the perception of Africa. So I think the perception is something that ought to be changed. So everybody knows these challenges in relation to integrity, etc. in Africa, but they are very much present in other parts of the world as well. So I'm personally involved in a couple of projects in Southeast Asia where things are happening that I haven't actually seen in Africa. So I think that sharing these success stories and giving investors confidence that you actually will be able to make a healthy return on your investments to Africa is absolutely important. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Fully agree. Maybe we should turn to Rakesh because you're in that business of changing perceptions, right? So what would it take to continue to change the perception of Africa? Because I would argue it has changed quite a bit over the last 15 years. But what would it take to continue changing it?
I think the first element for each of us is to start taking pride in ourselves. I think we are happier to talk about negative things than positive things. We wake up in the morning and we are happier to read sad news. You want to read sensational things, you want to see what's going wrong. You don't want to see what's happening on the economic side, what development is taking place, where the investments are happening, what policy matters. So I think the first change is in our own minds, in how we deal with things. First, try and change yourself in what you want to see and what you want to become yourself, because what you consume is a reflection of who you are. And I think this is the first thing, because nobody can change that unless you make an attempt yourself. Thank you. I think the second issue is that we don't talk about our success stories. So when we came into Africa, we found that there were news stories about doom and gloom all the time. And people were talking about despotic leadership, there's talked about corruption, they were talking about hundreds of other things that are going wrong. But then there are the same multinationals that are sitting here making pots of money. There's everybody else making money. There's economic activity, there are capital markets. There's a lot of development that is taking place, but nobody talks about it. And I think we need to start sharing these stories a little more And this is what we have done as a tangible change. And I'll give you an example. In 2008, when Kenya was burning after the elections, we were the only network that was allowed to broadcast live. And there was only one reason, because we were carrying a balanced view. We said, yes, there's a problem in the streets post the elections, but there's also economic activity taking place. People are coming to work. So I think carrying a balanced view is very, very important in how you deal with things. So, and then taking responsibility collectively as a region. And it's not just about, brand South Africa or brand Kenya or a few other agencies taking responsibility. I think we all need to go collectively to these major platforms around the world and present an African position, which is what is critical. We need to be seen as one force. We need to be seen as people that are actually making a difference. We need to talk about these opportunities that we have been discussing here since the morning and what we're going to talk about the next few days. So I think people will take you seriously if you talk positive things about what you're doing. And if they only hear negative things, it's never going to change.
Perfect. Ron, you're going to say something?
Thank you. So I think the lady from Benin's question is very important. If we look at the continent of Africa, it's a large landmass. Primarily, we're exporting commodities, we're importing containers and fuel into the continent over very long distances. Road doesn't make sense at all. Road doesn't make, whether you look at it from an environmental point of view or you look at it from a cost of rehabilitating road, if you look at accidents on road, it just doesn't make sense. The sort of volumes that the continent of Africa moves on road, it's not viable. The second is, if you look, because of the lack of, the model that makes sense, which has connected many countries around the world in different regions, is rail. And I think the point about Africa needs to invest in the railway sector is real. That discussion has been going on for time immemorial. Africa has to do something about its railways in order to be able to move goods, in order to integrate regions, in order to be able to move people and goods across the continent. It's a backbone industry, it's a backbone sector that has delivered immense benefit for a number of regions around the world. We have to invest in rail, it's inevitable.
And you'll go have that conversation in Benin?
I'm ready.
Okay. Good. Actually, it's funny, back to perceptions, I always remember, we as McKinsey have also been trying to play our role in changing the perception. And as we travel around the world to tell the different story of Africa, I remember some of my clients on the continent said, hey, we'd actually rather, you don't go out and tell these good stories, so everybody out there continues to have these bad perceptions, so they don't come in, and we'll continue to make money here and have less competition. So that's how some of the private sector people are thinking. Other questions, comments? Yes, there's one here. Oh, actually, can we start with the lady, and then the man? Okay.
Right, Fifi from CNBC Africa. Staying with perceptions. Many of the African economies that allow themselves to be rated by ratings agencies are rated as junk status, and this plays a role in pricing the risk premium of investing in the continent. So I'd like to find out from Ronnie and Rakesh what role ratings agencies have in perhaps changing the perception, which Ronnie says is mispriced in terms of the risk premium of investing on the continent.
Perfect.
I have some views on this subject which may not go well with people who are in that business. But I think rating agencies is a whole lot of bunkum. This has been created by financial institutions themselves. They funded them. They wanted their financial products to be endorsed by somebody, and they put this all together in terms of putting risk around different areas. I'm not saying it's not required. It's not required to benchmark risk. It's not important to look at what risk is, but I wouldn't pay too much attention to it. I think what you need to do is set up good governance, make sure that things work, look at all the things that we've been talking about since the morning, make sure that your financial markets, your capital markets, your major agencies and your regulatory bodies, your civil services work well. And if all of this works, you don't have to worry about rating agencies.
Okay, thank you. Actually, there are a number of hands, so let's take a few questions because we're running out of time. So let's start with the gentleman here.
Good morning. My name is Shamsu Anjorin from Benin. I'm here representing Boeing, not to sell airplanes, but to raise the voice of aviation in Africa. Just to give you an example, Africa represents 2.3% of global traffic 2.3% of the global traffic,
Yep.
with a potential to be around 15%,
Okay.
15 to 20%. So there is a huge gap. And worldwide, aviation has proved to be an accelerator, a growth accelerator. And I don't see, when we talk about infrastructure in Africa, we don't put enough emphasis on the role that aviation can play.
Perfect.
It is left to some experts that are believed to be the specialists. But it's the business of all of us.
Okay. So the question is the role of aviation.
What is what my expectation from this platform is to have the investment community look at aviation.
Aviation, okay, perfect.
And create the condition for airlines and aviation entrepreneurs to strive, because that will drive the economic growth of the continent.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to that because I know Ronnie has exposure there. There were some other questions. There was one at the back. And after him, we'll take one more and then, okay, quickly.
Good morning. My name is Charles Achaye from South Sudan. I know I'm the youngest nation in the country and perhaps the most troubled, according to the news. But I think what he has said, because he said that you need to brand yourself. And I think we have branded ourselves as a country who would want to come out of the crisis and look positively at the investment in Africa. So my question is, healthcare is also a big platform that we need to focus on. I'm in private sector dealing with pharmaceuticals importations, and would want to look at the African market from a different perspective. So my question to the platform or to the team is that, what investment criteria do we have to invest also in the health? Because we all look beautiful because we are healthy.
Okay.
And we think that it's important to stay healthy, to look at the infrastructures that we are thinking about. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So we have aviation, we have healthcare, we had railways before. So let's take these last two at the back here, and then we're going to unfortunately have to hear from our panelists and then end. So let's just take these, I'll come back. Let's take those two.
Thank you. My question is more directed to you, Leke. You mentioned earlier at the beginning that...
I'm the moderator.
Yes. Yes, my name is Stefadzwa from Zimbabwe, and I'm part of the Young Innovators. I'm curious to hear from your research what you found to be the contribution of small to medium enterprises. You were talking about the pipeline of investments and deals that you reviewed. I'm just curious to see what contribution small to medium entrepreneurs and enterprises make in the whole mix of things.
Okay.
Thank you.
And then next. Right here, he's right here.
I'm Danjuma Ibrahim from Dawib.
Sorry, can you put it closer?
Dawib Investment
Okay,
Resources from Nigeria. My question is, how do we solve this problem of upcoming entrepreneurs from the private sector accessing funds? Because that is the biggest challenge all upcoming entrepreneurs face.
Yeah.
If you look into Dangote and all others that have made it, you find out that they had very difficult startups. And I feel if we don't address that, so many ideas, so many businesses that would come up will go down the drain.
Perfect.
Because financial institutions, most of them want to see ready-made companies or people coming to look for money. And if we don't, you have to start somewhere.
Yep.
So how do you start somewhere if you are not assisted or recognized at all?
Perfect. Access to funding, very clear. All right, unfortunately, we're actually out of time. So let me ask you, Ronnie, to respond quickly, maybe on the aviation and the funding question given.
Yeah. So I couldn't agree more. I think the aviation sector on the continent needs to be looked at. Many of us travel through the continent, and we all know the difficulty of getting to even key hubs. It's a real challenge. The aviation sector needs to be invested in. We, for a long time, were a big investor in possibly the biggest private aviation company on the continent, called Come, which has the British Airways and Kulula brands in Southern Africa. We recognize the importance of aviation definitively. There's no debate about that. Again, it's about movement of people, and we need to achieve that if we're going to support regional integration, intra-Africa investment, definitively, without a doubt. In the question of small, medium-sized enterprise, also relating to capital, it's a very interesting one. The model that I really like is Germany, because Germany is built on what is called the Mittelstand, which is medium enterprises, effectively. But if you look at the structure, because in relation to finance, the question that the gentleman from Nigeria raises, finance needs sustainability. We can't run away from that. Small, medium enterprises are better positioned for sustainability if they're supplying to large projects. That way you deliver. If you're a small, medium enterprise, standalone, and you can't, because when you're looking for capital, I think capital wants certainty of payback. For them to see certainty of payback, they need to be able to see capacity to generate revenues. It's very difficult to borrow if you can't show sustainability of revenue to service your liability. I think it's fairly simple. So if you have, as an example, offtakes with a company that has a stronger balance sheet, it's a lot easier to finance. But if you're standalone and your business, your revenue today is X, tomorrow is Y, the day after it's below your cost, it's very difficult to finance. It's a practical issue. I understand the position of financiers.
Got you. Rakesh.
Well, I guess Ronnie's covered it all. I think since the time's up, what I'll do is give one final perspective. I think as we look at investments, particularly as private sector in the continent, one of the things that we advocate strongly with our senior management, as well as with my own children, is about looking at things in the long term. I think one of the areas we make the biggest mistake is when we start looking at businesses in short-term spells of quarters or looking at annual returns. You need to start moving your mindset into long-term investments. There used to be a discussion around legacy investments and investments that go for 50 years and 30 years. When I went to Prague, Charles University is 700 years old, and Charles IV is not remembered for anything other than that university. And so we need to start looking at investments as cathedral investments, investments that are going to stand and withstand everything that it comes under pressure around. Look long-term, and that's the only way you'll be successful in Africa.
Yeah. Long-term perspective, I like that. And just quickly, yes, we can clap for that, absolutely. On the question that was directed to me on the SME, I mean, our research is very clear. We always talk about, it's always large versus SMEs. It's clear that we need both, right? I'll give you an example. So why are large companies important? We just showed you, all the emerging markets that are fast growing, they have a number of large companies. We did this analysis across 8 countries on the continent. We looked at tax revenues. And what you find is the top 100, and the millions of companies in each of these countries, right? But the top 100 companies contribute 50 to 70% of tax revenues, right?
Correct.
That's what happens. And you need these large companies. And to Ronnie's point, what they do, and they then help the supply chain and the smaller companies who have to feed into them.
Correct.
They help professionalize them. So you need these large companies. We also need the SMEs. That's where most of the jobs get created, right? So you need both. The challenge, I think, on the SME front is also how do you scale them? Right? How do you get, I always say when you go to India, the 20 Dangotes, right? Here we always talk about Aliko. How do you get 20 of him? And so I think on the SME front is really how do you scale them to make sure that they actually can create and generate tens of thousands of jobs, which is what we need on the continent.
That's good.
But we are way out of time. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking my panel. And we'll be discussing all of these topics throughout the next 2 days. So let me just remind those of you who are interested in boardroom sessions, they are happening now. So please make your way to those boardroom sessions. You're the ones you're interested in. And then there's another session, I think, here on energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Archer.